Ever since I could remember things, Mr. Albois has been living in our settlement in his little cottage at the edge of the forest. He was old for a human, and to my 14-year-old self. Wrinkles were visible on his scarred face. His hair was mostly grey, and kept a big bushy beard and moustache that most elvish men don't. Yet despite his age, he was still a huge and strong person, almost a head taller than my father. I often saw him either jogging around the settlement outskirts in the morning, chopping up logs for firewood, or working on his little farm. And sometimes I see him sitting at his front door, with a pipe in his mouth, huffing and puffing smoke, waving at passing neighbours or curious children, including me, that were lurking around his cottage. I once asked my father about Mr. Albois. Why would an old human live in an elvish settlement instead of in the city with his kind? Then father told me this. Mr. Albois was once a warrior in the human army. During the last demonic incursion, he saved Lord Lorel from a host of Cyclops, so as gratitude, Lord Lorel offered Mr. Albois to live here after his retirement, which he accepted. This made me more curious about him, so one day I mustered all my courage and my friends and visited him. He might have looked scary at first, but was a surprisingly friendly person. Mr. Albois quickly became more and more popular amongst us children. Though none of us knew how to properly pronounce his full name, we just called him Big Al or Old Al. His Elvish was mediocre to say the least, but it was enough to facilitate us with adventures and war stories of his own. The last demon incursion, the Confederate Civil Wars, war against Midland Elves, and skirmishes against the Sidician Giants. I once threw a bomb, killed 2 orcs with it, then it exploded. You know, your old Albois was very popular among the ladies. Once there was a dark elf lady who... Oh wait, I should save this story for when you little ones are older. That giant was quick, but I was quicker. With nothing but a stone, I bashed him right in the head. Last time you said it was a stick, Mr. Albois. Did I? You must have misheard. I've always said it was a big rock. Have I ever told you children before that I killed a minotaur with my bare hands and teeth? That's right, a 10-foot-tall minotaur, with my teeth. Then he showed us his golden tooth that replaced one of the natural ones, which he claimed it broke when he ripped out the minotaur's throat. My friends and I enjoyed the stories, and of course the little snacks and gifts he gave us every time we visited. Though I personally didn't quite believe it was all true. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Albois must have been a great warrior, or soldier according to the human tongue after all. He did save Lord Lorel, but half of these stories seem so ridiculously exaggerated. Then, the day came when I was proven wrong. It was midnight when it happened. I was woken up by my mother. She had a concerned look on her face and said something was wrong. I quickly put on my shoes and cloak and began hearing shouting, and noises that seemed like fighting outside. My mother grabbed her bow and quiver, speaking in a lower voice for me to follow her closely. As she opened the door, a natural orange light pierced through the threshold. It was no moonlight, but a large fire, trees and houses in flames. Now that I peeked over the edge of our treehouse's hanging gangway, I can now see what was causing all these. Goblins, orcs and demonic beastings were rampaging through the streets and houses. Most of our garrison, including my father, was out for goblin purging miles away, and would take some time for them to return, even for elvish footing. Afterwards, I was told this was a trick of the enemy, to lure our strongest warriors away so our defense is weak. Then under the cover of goblin shaman dark magic they snuck in. Though most of us elves know how to fight, even as civilians, due to our mandatory combat training since childhood, the attack was too subtle for us to organise any proper defence. It was everyone for themselves, fighting at the doorstep or shooting them from rooftops, hoping to stem the rampaging horde and bide time for the warriors to return. Mother held my hands and we began moving towards the garrison fortress, which had the highest chance of any kind of organised defence, and most likely the safest place in the whole settlement. On our way we were joined by a few of our neighbours, and had to fight through the few small packs of spider-riding goblins that got in our way. But most of them were dealt with swiftly. The majority of the invaders must have been distracted by the more populated market centre. But once we hit the main road, the situation became worse. Many besides us had the same idea of seeking refuge in the fortress. The larger column drew more attention, and more enemies came rushing in our way. Our progress became slower and slower, as we had to turn back and fight the pursuing wave of orcs, beastlings and goblins. The situation was getting desperate. More and more people were wounded and even killed during the fighting, and Mother suffered a deep cut to her left arm, rendering her unable to use a bow anymore. The worst came when a Minotaur smashed through a building from our right, cutting right into the crowd. Our orderly fighting withdrawal degraded into a panic retreat. Then my hand was separated from Mother's, thrown into the ground by the shockwave of an exploding fireball cast by a goblin shaman. When I regained consciousness, my head was spinning and my vision was blurry. It took an effort to push myself up. My ears rang and the chaos around me became muffled background. Mother was laying a few feet away from me, completely still. I stumbled towards her, and dread began to creep up in my chest. I called out for Mother and shook her, but she was not responding. I shook again, shouting, "Mother!" louder this time. Tears began to uncontrollably run down my face, as I felt utterly helpless and frustrated. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over me. I turned and saw the most horrific sight of my life. An orc, armoured in crude but thick metal plate, armed with a bloody axe and saliva dripping between his tusks. It laughed and slowly raised his axe, as if it was savouring this moment. My legs became unresponsive with fear, even when my mind was screaming, "Run! Get up and run!" The axe raised to the highest point. The orc's muscular arm bulged as he prepared for the swing. Then his head exploded in a mist of red and dark skin, followed by a loud bang as if a thunderclap during the storm. A big figure approached from the corner of my tearing eyes and knelt beside me. It was Mr. Albois, holding a boomstick. He had donned an outfit I'd never seen before, a white jacket and trousers, with blue collars and long sleeves, shoulders decorated with red epaulettes, and a big bearskin hat sat on top of his head. Every brass button or decorative plate was polished to a shiny glim. "Are you all right, little one?" he said. Relief sets in and my tears erupted into a ball, unable to formulate a coherent response. All I could mutter out between my sobs was, "Mother." Mr. Albois checked on Mother, putting his finger in front of Mother's nose and her neck, and let out a sigh of relief. "She's alive, little one, just hurt. Let's get her into somewhere safe and someone can treat her, eh?" With a grunt, he lifted Mother up with one arm. I nodded, trying my best to stop the sobbing, and wiped away the tears from my face, then helped Mr. Albois shoulder some of the weight. Our progress wasn't easy. Oftentimes I had to carry Mother on my back as Mr. Albois turned to fight the approaching beastlings, orcs and goblins. He fought with a sense of efficiency and years-old experience. He worked the bolt on his boomstick, or as he told me, the Chatellian rifle, in a fluid motion. Pull, insert a paper cartridge from his pouch, push, aim, then a large bang. With every shot, either a head exploded, limbs were torn off, or a chest burst open. When Mr. Albois did not have time to reload, he resulted in using the short spike attached to the end of his rifle, or the thick wooden stock, parrying every blow precisely, as if he was one of those spearmasters, then retaliated with a perfect thrust or skull-crushing smash with the stock. Mr. Albois also fought with a bad mouth. Though I picked up some naughty words, I've never heard a man swear so much and with such toxicity. Sometimes in his wonky elvish, sometimes in human tongue, mostly involving genitals, sexual intercourse, feces, and a fixation on one's mother. Such as, "Eat this, you dung-eating lowlife!" and the most memorable one being, "Your mother's a whore and she stinks like elderberries!" Eventually we could see the fortress itself, but we were too late. The guards were urging the last remaining people in, and the drawbridge was about to be lifted, as the main horde was about to arrive any second now. "Excuse me," said Mr. Albois, before I could ask, "For what?" He strapped his rifle on his back, then lifted me on his left shoulder, while Mother was on the right. Then he sprinted. Actually, no. He charged. He ran faster than any horse I've seen. He must have covered at least 100 yards within 20 seconds. "Wait!" he shouted, at the top of his lungs. A few guards heard and turned around, but the drawbridge was already lifting. Some called to the gatehouse to stop, but I was sure they were not going to risk it for us, as the horde was right behind us. Mr. Albois probably knew this as well, but he didn't stop. He kept his pace and shouted again, louder this time, when he was about to reach the fortress's moat. "Catch them!" Before I could process what he meant, I was propelled into the air and arched over the drawbridge, followed by my mother. We were both caught and cushioned by the guards. I recovered and immediately crawled up the already half-lifted drawbridge, ignoring the guards' word for me to come back. Mr. Albois was still out there. I reached the edge and called out for him, extending my hand as if he could jump all the way over the moat. But he was exhausted, panting, bent down and with hands on his knees. He heard my voice and looked up, waved at me and smiled, as if he was just sitting on his rocking chair outside his doorway during a casual afternoon. I turned back to the guards beside me. "We can't just leave him out there. Help him. Throw him a rope or anything." They all showed bitter expressions, shaking their heads. The drawbridge was heavily inclined. I clung onto the edge, reluctant to let go, and started crying again. "It's okay, little one," Mr. Arbois shouted as if to comfort me. "It's all right. Don't worry about me." But the horde was now very close, just a couple 100 yards beyond the moat, and moving in slowly in formation. "Here, take this!" He ripped something off his collar, then threw it to me. I caught it with one hand, but my other lost the grip, and I slid down the almost shut drawbridge. "Keep it safe for me!" His shouting voice came beyond the gate. I looked down. It was a piece of gold-decorated metal plate, shaped as a five-cornered star. The source symbol of the Jatamar Republic was embossed in the centre. I shot off the hands of a guard and ran up to the walls. I must see what was going on beyond the gates. I squeezed past the armed men and made it onto the ramparts. Mr. Arbois stood there, raised in front of our gates, back towards us, rifle rested next to his hips, the sharp spike slightly raised and pointed at the enemy. The horde of demonic creatures all stopped, right outside our arrow range, but not that they feared our archers. Something was commanding them to halt. A minotaur, an almost 10-foot tall monstrous creature with horns so big and muscles so thick as if he could tear open our stone walls with his bare hands. In his hands was a mighty sword that radiated a hellish aura. It roared as if to initiate a single combat challenge. Mr. Arbois replied, with a voice that matched that minotaur. "I am Arbois de Pontois, of the Jatamar Old Guard, and you shall not pass this gate as long as I draw breath." Then he pointed his rifle like a spear with one hand towards the hulking minotaur. "I have been killing your kind since I was 16. I will gladly shove you back to the hellhole that shut you out." Both sides roared and were simultaneously and charged, the minotaur with his blade, and Mr. Arbois with his bayonet-fixed rifle. The minotaur was indeed powerful. His strength and speed were enhanced by the Demon Lord's dark sorcery, and every swing and smash could have cleaved through a war chariot with one blow. Although Mr. Arbois could not compete in raw strength, he matched the minotaur with skill, experience, and agility. Every strike was either dodged or parried with such precision that the massive blade missed by a hair. A small sidestep, or a well-timed deflection on the flat of the sword made it miss its mark. Then, with every chance, he countered, stepping at the sword arm, armor joints, or legs. Sometimes the minotaur was able to block or step away, but eventually, Mr. Arbois drew first blood, wounding the beast's sword hand and forcing him to drop the blade. At first, most of the elves on the ramparts thought Mr. Arbois was going to die, chopped to pieces in a few seconds. Then more of us began to cheer him on. "Big Al! Big Al! Big Al!" I shouted the loudest, hoping that he could hear me and that it could help him win the fight. But I almost forgot he was already tired, his stamina drained for the continued fighting, not to mention his age. I could start to see the fatigue settling in, his deflecting parry becoming less precise, the dodges slower. He began to bleed as well. A strong low swiping strike came. This time Mr. Arbois couldn't jump out of the way and was forced to block it. The great claw cracked his rifle and sent him flying to the side. He rolled a few times on the ground and stopped, and struggled to recover from it, his shaky arms and legs strained to lift himself up. The cheering died. Many gasped or clenched their fists, thinking, "This is it. Old Arbois is no more." But I refused to believe that. I gathered my breath and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Mr. Arbois!" He must have heard it, and as if he had drank a strength potion, with a great cry he lifted himself up from the floor. He picked his bearskin hat up and wore it on top of his head again. The minotaur let out a sound similar to a laugh, as if the fight was too short, it would have been boring. It charged at the full speed again, claws formed into a fist. Mr. Arbois ducked and weaved, dodging the hail of punches and swings, then drew his short sword. As one strike barely missed and caught the edge of his head, he jumped in between the arms, then leapt, plunging the blade up the minotaur's unarmored throat. The sharp blade penetrated deep and sank into his throat. The minotaur gave a frantic swing and swept Mr. Arbois off itself. Mr. Arbois was thrown off the side again, but this time he got up quicker. But the short sword in his hand disappeared. It must have slipped due to the impact. He looked around and picked up a piece of rock, then led toward the minotaur, now choking with his own blood and half kneeling on the ground, attempting to stop the bleeding with his big claws with no effect. The minotaur saw Mr. Arbois coming and swung one of its arms to keep him away, while the other instinctively remained on his wound. Mr. Arbois ducked under it and leapt forward. With a bone-shattering sound, smashed the rock directly on the face of the minotaur. It was thrown on its back, and Mr. Arbois climbed on top of it, then began smashing down with both hands. With each strike he shouted, "I'm Thut! On Thut! My thud. Fucking crack. Vacation! The rock broke into two in his hands, and he looked at it with disappointment, as the Minotaur was still alive, though barely. His claws still weakly pushed against Mr. Arbois. Then, a sight I would never forget, the tales were true. In the most savage way, Mr. Arbois opened his mouth and bit deep into the Minotaur's throat. His sharp claws clawed at Mr. Arbois' back, with a last attempt to fight back. Then, with a swing of his head, Mr. Arbois ripped the throat out of the Minotaur, blood splattering on this white and blue uniform. He spat the chunk of flesh out. Now the Minotaur's arms were completely still, motionless. Mr. Arbois got off the corpse and turned towards the horde of orcs, goblins and beastings, mouth and hand still covered in Minotaur blood. "Who's next?" he shouted, and the formation lines backed up a little. He shouted again, "Who's next?" With this, the hordes of demonic creatures slowly wavered, then turned around and started to retreat. The ramparts erupted in cheers and praises, all shouting his name. Once the guards confirmed the enemies were truly gone, the drawbridge was lowered, and I was the first to run out towards Mr. Arbois, now laying on the ground. I knelt down beside him, worried that he would succumb to his wounds. "Mr. Arbois?" I asked. He opened his eyes and looked towards me. Hello there, little one." He was utterly exhausted. Another new addition to his collection of facial scars, and half of his right ear was missing. The once beautiful uniform was ripped in many places and now soaked in blood, either of the Minotaur or of his own. "I'm too old for this shit," he said, then smiled. The golden tooth was missing.